Alright, hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well. I hope lunch was great.
Yes.
All comfortable? Everyone filled?
Yes.
Wonderful. First of all, huge thanks to Animation Keploy for having me over. It's really good to be here. A little round of applause for them, guys. Now, before I kind of jump into some of my content, I do have a question here for people, and I'm sure you've had this question a few times, but just once more. How many people here have contributed to any open source project? How many people here maintain any open source project? Oh, we have a few maintainers as well, nice. Aside from the Keploy team, by the way. How many people here have participated in any session on how to get started in open source? All on YouTube or on Google Meet? We've had a few, right? Great. Now, being someone who works at an open source company today, and having been around open source communities, projects, maintainers, contributors for the last few years now, I think there's been one particular challenge and problem that keeps getting discussed again and again and again. And this problem, it's something I'm sure all of us here must have come across on social media, on Twitter. It's something that does get discussed a lot. And the problem has been around how open source projects and communities can maintain a sustainable growth process and how it can remain healthy for everyone. Because we've all seen incidents, we've all seen problems and challenges in the past. So with this particular talk, what I'll spend is some time discussing how contributors play a role on this front, aside from the maintainers, in complement to the maintainers, and how we as contributors can help keep our open source projects healthier and allow them to grow sustainably. Before we kind of go forward further, I am Aditya. I work as a developer advocate at Oberai. I've got my social handles there. I've got my Twitter and my GitHub. And by the way, clicking of pictures and sharing on social media is highly encouraged. Please do so. For sure, don't forget to tag Keploy, and if you do tag me, I'd be happy to interact and retweet as well. Now, when I talk about this challenge that we've got, of course, I will spend some time getting into this problem, particularly certain incidents we've seen, and then we'll go ahead further and define what community health means in the context of open source. We'll then go forward towards discussing a little bit more about ownership, and we'll finish off with some healthy contribution practices that I do recommend. These are something that I've learned over my time at Oberai so far, and these are practices that I do hope we'll be able to take back from as well as we all go through this entire event. So, starting off with the problem. One of the biggest problems that we're seeing across open source projects, something that a lot of maintainers have talked about, something that we as contributors have noticed and observed, and it's been talked about on and on and on again on Reddit, Twitter, and all of these platforms, is that we've now got this phase where too many new contributors have rushed into open source for a lot of the wrong reasons, right? Like, for example, I asked that we had a few people who've, whether they've attended a session on how to get started with open source or not. We had a few people, right? How many of you have ever heard participate and you'll get a piece of swag? Or contribute and you'll get a job? That's been fairly common, right, as advice. The problem is that because it is often not shared with any basis or reasons, or whether such rewards are consequences or whether they should be goals, we've got a lot of people who've now just understood of open source as that tool where you go participate and I'll get a very nice high-paying remote job. Or 4 PRs and we'll get a t-shirt. How many people remember that one from Hacktoberfest? Right? This whole problem's grown to the point where we've now actually seen major incidents, right? Like, for example, within the Node.js community, I think the Express repo had a major spamming issue recently, where they had over 1,000 PRs trying to add just a name in the README of the project. Because a certain YouTube channel used Express as an example to show how to fork and make a PR. And then they gave the disclaimer that you're only supposed to do that on projects you're involved with and not do so meaninglessly after the tutorial was shown, right? Similarly, we've had PR spamming cases in Hacktoberfest where We've legitimately had a dedicated Twitter handle called Shitoverfest just to give shout outs to these incidents and PRs which have caused these issues. And of course, forced contributions that have a supposed hiring advantage. How many people here are hiring managers, by the way, who've actually hired for their companies? How many of you have actually seen a massive emphasis on open source or GitHub in recent times? So it's been a growing trend as well, especially in a lot of the conversations I've had. Strongly growing. And a lot of it, people are going to talk about how they've become the greatest open source contributors, and when you open, it's been a spelling fix. It's a growing challenge. And this isn't to say spelling fixes are bad, by the way, but we've been seeing this problem on and off. Now, I do want to emphasize the blame on this front is not on the contributors, in my opinion. I think when we talk about this whole challenge, there's been, of course, a lapse of awareness and a lapse of education, because we've had creators trying to talk about it, but they've shared actually what happens without enough context, and because there's been a lot of conversations without enough context, people have learned from a very different basis altogether. Overall, this has created a cycle where now there's been massive community burnout within open source, where we'll see maintainers just opting out of initiatives like Hacktoberfest or refusing to work with certain groups and individuals simply because they're too burnt out and tired to deal with such problems at all, right? It doesn't make sense to blame the contributors. The maintainers have their own issues, but it's led to a whole cycle where things have gotten unhealthy for the entire community. So I think when I looked at this problem, one thing that I do emphasize and one thing that I did return to is that I think we need to start defining community health in the same conversation, where we start talking about how to contribute to open source, why someone should contribute to open source. Because unless there is a sense of responsibility, unless that is inculcated at the same time, we're going to lead to the same cycle happening again and again and again. So when we talk about community health, does anyone want to give this a shot, by the way, and try and answer what community health means to them? Anyone? Any thoughts?
Quality contributors.
Well, community contributors would contribute to that, but what would community health mean?
So community health, right, it includes the quality of contributions as well. So for example, if, as you said, a lot of spamming contributions start coming in, then it sort of takes a toll on the maintainers and people who are actually part of the core committee to actually manage that community.
Yep.
So that is one aspect that affects the community health.
Quality is definitely a part of it for sure. That's a good point. Anything else?
Or how smooth is the work going forward to achieve the goals? Is it going, going and coming back, starting and coming?
I think a clear roadmap is important for the project.
Roadmaps are a part of it. For sure, these are all aspects to it, yes.
Code of conduct should be there.
Code of conduct, absolutely. All of them are very valid components that help add to community health. When I like to define it, I do talk about it as the well-being and sustainability for sure is an important aspect, but the well-being, sustainability and effectiveness of the community working on the project. So whether it's leading to the right goals, it's leading to the right roadmap, whether the quality of contributions is consistently sustaining. All of these are factors that do affect and impact community health. And so, in this process, when we do actually define what a healthy community is, there are certain characteristics I like to talk about. Active participation and continuous engagement is the first one. Any healthy community in open source will have constant and consistent communication going on and on and on. The day communication ends, you do have to consider that the community is not sustaining. Secondly, an inclusive and open environment for everyone. A community that can include anyone regardless of what their background has been, who they are, where they come from, their walk of life. If they can find space and encourage everyone, regardless of all of that, to participate, that does contribute to the health of a community. Effective communication channels. Of course, you can communicate, but unless you have a place where you can do that successfully, that's not going to be a healthy community. So having effective channels, whether those are forums, mailing lists, chat rooms, any of that. It doesn't have to be one of them. It doesn't have to be just that, unless it has a Discord, it's a failure. There's no such rule. As long as it is a medium that enables success in communication for the community, you're good to go. Then of course, transparent decision making. Has anyone here heard of incidents where you've had an open source project, seen very weird decision making made by one person unilaterally and the entire community disagrees with it? We've had a few examples already. Cyanogen body, okay. We've got valid examples here, but we've all seen these challenges, right? Unless there is transparency when we talk about open source projects, you're not going to have a system of trust, which is absolutely necessary. So transparency is very important in this. Then of course, strong leadership to guide the community, having a certain vision, a certain goal, like we mentioned roadmap here already. It is necessary because unless there is a direction that is worth following, the projects and the community around it will go haywire. Code of conduct, we had code of conduct mentioned. That is crucial in my opinion for any open source project and its community, because that is what defines what communication patterns are healthy, what communication patterns are valid, what to do and what not to do, more importantly. Then of course we've got well-maintained documentation. Documentation is always crucial in this front, and especially not just documentation around the project, but also about processes, right? Like for example, when we look at AppWrite and our documentation, we'll have a lot of contributors, but unless we define what practices to follow when making a PR or with branching or so on, we're going to see very erratic behavior as well, right? Which makes it very difficult for anyone and everyone to operate and contribute. Things like that are important to keep in mind. Collaboration and teamwork, of course, is going to be key, and it should have a growth opportunity for everyone, right? If you're learning and you're growing and it is opening your doors for you, that is a successfully healthy community. If it isn't, there are things to think about as to where this is taking, because unless there is a two-way balance where both the project grow and the people contributing to it grow, unless that happens, it's not going to be a healthy experience for one major group. So these are some characteristics I have that define what a healthy community is. But within this entire discussion, one thing we didn't touch upon is the relation between maintainers and contributors. I think one major reason why a lot of this problem grew as well is because we've talked about how to contribute, why to contribute, but what after? What we never actually talk about is whether contributors can take initiative, whether they should take charge, whether they can take responsibility. And so because this hasn't been talked about and we've had a lot of new contributors come into the picture, a lot of people are going to jump in, rush in, make some step thinking about what it means for them, and then not take the necessary responsibility or the accountability, because a lot of them don't know that they own that as well in the first place. So there are some myths that do need to be clarified about ownership within these communities as well at the same point of time. First myth. Has anyone here heard that unless you've created the project, you have no ownership about it? Anyone come across that in the past? At least when you look at a lot of newer projects coming up, this is a misunderstanding that does come across. And in my opinion, truth be told, any open source project, ownership is always shared. It is never owned by a single person. Yes, they might hold accountability, but so do all the other members who are contributing in that entire circle. It is never individually owned by one person and one person only. It is always shared across. Second myth, only maintainers can exercise leadership. Only maintainers help take decisions. Only maintainers can tell what is right or wrong. Unless you're a maintainer, you're not allowed to comment on a PR. That is not true. Leadership has to be distributed, and it can very well be shared between contributors, participants, regardless of whether they're a maintainer or not. In fact, the more it is shared, the more it makes everyone's life easier. Contributors are only followers and not leaders. Like we said, contributors can't review PRs, or they can't help raise the necessary issues or raise feature requests. That is not true. There is no one stopping contributors from taking charge on this front. In fact, it is encouraged and it is healthier if people do actually take up these responsibilities. Because if we don't have that happen, you're going to have a very siloed thinking process where maybe 5 people will be deciding what's good for the next 1,000. That can very much happen if we don't share this responsibility. So contributors can and should take charge. Contributors cannot influence project direction. This is probably one of the most untrue statements that I have heard over my time. Because, truth be told, a contributor can come up with an idea and a solution that can change the direction and the goals of a project entirely as well. Contributors come up with some of the best ideas because they're often also better representative of the people who actually lead these projects in the first place, right? Unless if we are talking to the people who are actually using them, which too often form the basis of most contributors, you're never going to know what the project needs to be eventually. So, absolutely yes, contributors can influence direction. And yes, of course, the definition of ownership in itself always has to come into question, because when we talk about this misconception, the basis, of course, for a lot of people is that when we talk about ownership, it just means that it's my thing, right? I own it. I have rights to it. The thing is, in open source, ownership doesn't work like that. It is going to be shared. It is going to be, distributed, and it represents responsibility and accountability more than anything else, right? When we stand as stewards of our projects, we are standing at the forefront of the stages, representing them, standing for them, but that does not mean that it is private property. There can be exceptions to that, by the way, but on a general level for open source projects, it does not mean that it's private property. And yeah, one thing, by the way, open source can mean anything, anyone can change anything. This is probably one note that comes out of frustration from educators and creators. I think we've got to stop giving the example of taking a big project and adding a name to a README. That's definitely not what contributing to open source means, especially in a healthy manner, right? Every contribution holds a certain impact. Every contributor has that responsibility. It is important to remember that because every action has repercussions going far beyond a certain individual. Now, the reason I've talked about all of these is because unless we're clear on some of these myths, we can't propagate the right message either. We can't educate about it. We can't discuss about it, right? Because we need to be sure about it before we can help support someone else trying to get started. So, in that process, at least for any of us who are contributing, it is a good idea to define certain healthy practices of contribution. And these practices are something that we are actually practicing at Upright, and we have grown to quite a large community of open source contributors now. We've got over 800 contributors. We've got almost 40,000 GitHub stars. It's grown to a massive point. And these are practices that we've developed learning from these experiences. These practices will be focused more on contribution rather than maintenance, by the way. The reason for that is because I think we need more education on the front of contributions. Maintenance does come over eventually after you've grown as a contributor. So, when we talk about healthy contribution practices and how contributors can help and improve the community experience, the first point I have for anyone contributing is wait and have patience till you're actually assigned to a problem, right? Unless you're communicating with the maintainers, unless you're understanding these problems, unless you're allocated to it, if you start rushing into these processes, you're only going to create problems because there's a high chance someone else is already allocated and working on these challenges. If not, and you just kind of work on it before being assigned, you got lucky. In any big open source project, there is going to be a communication and allocation process for this, which is necessary. So this way, you're able to keep an experience where you're not creating a ruckus for other contributors and keeping things a little cleaner for the maintainers. Secondly, making objectively valuable contributions. Now what this means is, unless your contribution has objective value and not subjective value, it is going to create a definite impact. An easier way to understand this is, so you go to a project's documentation, you find spelling mistakes. Spelling mistakes for everyone is going to create, fixing those is going to create objectively equal value. Changing a paragraph from active to passive voice is not. It's probably just gonna confuse more people because there's a change that doesn't objectively add value. So, objective value is important. It is important to understand that, it is important to keep that in mind as you raise your contributions and your issues as well along with that. Third, focusing on quality rather than quantity. Now, because we've got this whole problem, right, where we've talked about people kind of rushing in just because they've heard that it benefits them from a career perspective, we also see a lot of people rushing in creating PRs and contributions just for the sake of it, which isn't a good idea because it's only going to create more maintainer overhead. It's only going to create any maintainer, they're going to look at problems that they need to review in the way of a queue. But if you've got too much of spam within that, it basically becomes spam. Having quality is going to make sure that A, you're not wasting the maintainer's time, so they can actually go through these review processes faster, and B, it means you're creating objective value again, right? It means that your work is going to have an impact. And unless it's having an impact, it's not really going to help you or anyone else for that matter. That goes both ways, right? Only if it's helping everyone with open source is it going to help you, and otherwise it's not. Then of course, yes, please don't call dibs on issues. This is a major problem. Whenever Hacktoberfest comes up, we're going to open an issue and you're going to find 5 people rushing in and saying, I want to work on this, I want to work on this, I want to work on this. Here's the thing. If I have one bug, I have one issue about it, and 20 people come and say, I want to work on this, only one can still actually do that. So there's no point kind of rushing in and just starting calling dibs on every single issue. And yeah, the other side of it is if you've got one issue, you prioritize that one issue. If you start commenting on 10 different issues at the same time, you can't spend time on 10 issues either, right? It's only going to slow down everyone's process. It's only going to block other people. Again, makes things unhealthy for everyone. So don't call dibs on issues. Have one, prioritize one, focus on that and create quality. Then of course, yes, now in case there is actually an issue where there is a line, you're probably next, and the contributor might not have given an immediate reply. This you might have noticed in Hacktoberfest issues especially, this, where I've noticed the most is, someone got assigned to an issue. It hadn't been one day, and the next person started messaging, they haven't commented, they haven't contributed, can I take over? The answer to that is no, you cannot. Most people when they're contributing are doing this outside of their daily lives, right? Unless you're lucky enough to be in an open source company, you're not doing it as a part of your job, right? It is complementary to everything else you do. So there needs to be some amount of patience for everyone in this process, right? If you wait 3, 4, 5 days, there is no communication about progress, there is nothing informed, maybe then you can ask if there are any blockers, if there's anyone where you can help out, and maybe eventually the maintainers will let you take over accordingly. But just rushing in and pushing on that is not going to help. On that note, please do communicate progress if you are assigned to an issue with your maintainers. Give periodic updates, please let them know where you are. If you're going through certain steps, if you're facing certain problems, unless they know they can't help you, unless you tell them, you are going to remain stuck. Communication is key in this process. Alright? Being patient with maintainers. I can't emphasize more on this. I do say this from a point of privilege because I get to work for an open source company, so I do get paid a salary to work on open source. Most OSS maintainers don't get that. Okay. Open source work and maintenance is often thankless, payless, and it is still invaluable, right? We've all seen that XKCD meme, right? Where you've got a whole stack of blocks and there's one little tiny block supporting the entire thing. That's what most open source maintainers get to experience. So please be patient, please be respectful, please don't start getting pushy on maintainers because you didn't get a reply in the next 3 minutes of putting in your message. They've all got their daily lives just like you do. Just like you might not have time, they don't either, right? Patience is going to be very, very important in that process. By the way, one place where contributors can really add value, and this is more so as a plus, is you can actually help out maintainers in their responsibilities by helping with reviews, helping look through code, helping find any problems in PRs. That actually makes things healthy for everyone. That makes maintainers' jobs easier, and it's an objective way of adding value, right? Just because you weren't the one creating the PR doesn't mean you can't help out with it. So doing that, it's always good to do. And yes, please give and accept feedback constructively and humbly. One of the most special things of open source is you have absolutely no idea the person you're communicating, where and who the person you could communicating with is. You have no idea whether they're just someone at the same experience level as you, or whether there's someone who's starting off, or whether they've got 10, 20 years more experience than you, right? You get to learn that along the process. And the thing is, anyone and everyone can learn and grow through this. But unless feedback and help is constructive, it's not gonna happen. So you do need to make sure that when you are communicating and when you are sharing your reviews and feedback, it is meant to have a positive impact rather than destroy someone's work. Going forward, it's just necessary to remember and propagate that ensuring that open source remains healthy is not just the job of a maintainer. It is not just the job of an open source influencer. It's not just the job of an open source leader. It is everyone's responsibility. Whether you're contributing for the first time, whether you're someone who's been doing it, of course, for a while, everyone has to proactively work towards this, share this responsibility, help educate about it, and help support their peers through this. That is the only way open source projects are going to sustain. Otherwise, they will become unhealthy experiences for everyone and die out, which it's not just my opinion, but if that's gonna happen, that's gonna be very bad for all of software engineering today. So yeah, I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. By the way, a lot of what I shared today, especially characteristics of healthy communities and these steps are documented on this blog as well. If you do want to read it later, you can scan the QR. I can share a link to that later while we're catching up as well. But yeah, that's mostly it for me. Thanks a lot. It was great sharing. And I think we have a couple of minutes so we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions if there are any. Yeah.
So I have mainly one question. So you mentioned that there's a lot of contributors coming in your project calling tests on issues and wanting to reassign issues. Does it happen mainly in context of Hacktoberfest, or have you faced that in normal scenarios as well?
So there can be any sort of a bump that happens. Like the whole Express issue was not Hacktoberfest. It was basically one YouTube channel kind of using it as an example, right? Hacktoberfest has been a phase where it's happened in the past, but it can really happen at any point of time. And in general, we've seen more and more of a rush towards open source projects anyway, which is a great thing, but unless done in a sustainable manner, it's going to create bad experiences for everyone.
For example, in programs like GSOC,
Yeah.
There may be multiple students interested in the same idea. So, do you think that students should not go for the same idea and try to explore different projects if some student has already been working on an idea? Or are you more proponent of having 2 competitive proposals for the same idea?
No, of course, when we talk about a program like GSOC, it's going to automatically put people up in a competitive scenario, right? Open source contribution goes beyond that. So, from a competitive perspective, if it's really to get into the program, then probably yes, having clashing proposals means someone's gonna have a problem. If it's purely about contributing, you can just collaborate together and work on it anyway, which I do personally prefer, if I'm honest. Like for me, I did not really participate in the program. I've appreciated it for sure, but there are competitive aspects that we could do without as well. And of course, GSOC has its list of organizations. There is more to open source outside that as well. But for sure, it's been a great program. So, you could always give it a shot. I think one thing I do recommend in that is you can always talk to the project leads and the maintainers within that to take their advice as to how they deal with such conflicts as well. Because if they recommend collaboration, then maybe you can just collaborate anyway. I'm not sure how that works, so probably the project leads and so on will be the best people to discuss that with. Yeah.
So normally, like we do open source contribution.
Mm-hmm.
We do open source contribution.
Thank you. So, if I contribute one time, so okay, in 1 year, and then I start contributing 20 typo. I just fix a typo, okay, and I call myself an open source contributor.
Okay.
On other instance, I am doing contribution of renowned like MDN, GitHub, Microsoft. So, is it good to add exactly open source contributor on this means?
See, here's my question. What do you get out of adding open source contributor on your profile, right?
Yes.
The thing is, technically, both are open source contributors, right? But when it comes to using the basis of your contributions as a factor, right? If I say I'm an open source contributor as an applicant, my GitHub will be looked at, right? So the question is that regardless of what I call myself, is the value I've created going to help my own growth or endorse my skills? If the answer to that is yes, then sure, go for it. If the answer is no, then probably it's a good idea to spend some time contributing before you kind of start using those titles, right? Because it really does come down to what you're gaining out of it and what not. Title or not, I'm like, if you're saying your GitHub is good, I'm gonna look at it, right? So I don't think it matters as much. I'd open up your GitHub and take a look anyway. I think probably now we're at time. Thanks a lot. It was lovely sharing this, and I think Leon's going to be the next speaker, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.